Good afternoon, and welcome to our inaugural AOS virtual lecture. My name is Joan Richardson, and I'll be your host. I want to thank David Wolf for his vision and support in starting this lecture series. Also, thanks so much to Rosemary Lindley of the McGovern Academy of Oslerian Medicine and our AV tech, Nicholas Galvez, for making it all happen. And it's been interesting. Our speaker today, Dr. Bruce Fye, is well known to all of us. A member of the American Osler Society for almost 50 years and AOS president in 1988, he is a cardiologist, now retired from the Mayo Clinic. But first and foremost, he is a bibliomaniac. Now, Bruce says that he is a recovering bibliomaniac, but as we all know, that is an incurable affliction. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Fye, who will be speaking on medical book collecting and scholarship, a recovering bibliomaniac's perspective. Bruce, the virtual floor is now yours.
Well, Joan, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And having been a member of the American Osler Society since 1978, it is a privilege to lead off this new series of virtual talks. This is an image of my copy of the program of that Kansas City meeting, which I asked everyone to sign. The photograph depicts the individuals who nominated me for membership when I was a little boy. Jerry Barondess on the left is the only living person who's been a member of the society longer than me, and that's pretty humbling. Jerry's 100 years old. A. McGee Harvey, known as Mac to many of us at that era, on the right was my medical history mentor at Johns Hopkins when I was a Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholar. In this presentation, I will discuss medical book collecting from the perspective of a bibliomaniac who developed a passion for historical research and writing 50 years ago. First, I'll describe some medical bibliophiles who contributed to scholarship during the last quarter of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century. Then I'll consider some forces that transformed book collecting during the past half century. Finally, I'll touch on some of the challenges confronting current-day medical book collectors and the implications these have for scholarship and for the development of special collections housed in institutional libraries. Samuel Gross was America's leading surgeon during the middle decades of the 19th century. A busy practitioner, celebrated teacher, and prolific author, he was also a bibliomaniac. Gross confessed, "Nothing apart from my immediate family has afforded me greater happiness than my library. I've always been passionately fond of books and have spent money freely on their purchase. In fact, I have more books than I have room for. Bookcase after bookcase has been put up, and yet books are scattered all over the floor." Gross enjoyed writing as much as he loved books. He explained, "Many of my happiest days and nights have been spent with my pen, in the silence of my study, in the midst of my books." The Philadelphia surgeon bibliophile recognized the value of focused or thematic collecting and assembled major subject collections devoted to anatomy and surgery. He used them to write a valuable history of America's medical literature and a biography of John Hunter. Gross wanted future generations to benefit from his bibliomania. Fortunately, the College of Physicians of Philadelphia was eager to preserve his valuable collection of several thousand volumes. They accepted it in 1884, the same year William Osler moved to the city from Montreal. The college's library would be the Osler's bookish home during his 5-year tenure as a faculty member of the University of Pennsylvania. John Shaw Billings was another prominent 19th century bibliophile. In addition to being America's greatest medical bibliographer, he was an institutional bibliomaniac of legendary stature. During the final third of the century, Billings was director of the Surgeon General's Library, which would become the National Library of Medicine. During his tenure, the library's collection exploded, from about 2,000 to 120,000 volumes. His appetite for acquiring books for the nation's medical library was insatiable. Harvard anatomist and popular author Oliver Wendell Holmes warned, "Dr. Billings is a bibliophile of such eminence that I regard him as a positive danger to the owner of a library if he's ever let loose in it alone." Holmes, like Gross and Billings, believed that libraries must be more than passive repositories of books. Speaking at the Boston Medical Library's opening in 1878, he asked rhetorically, "What is the nest that hatches scholars but a library?" In 1964, a century after Billings took charge of the Surgeon General's Library, John Blake was chief of the National Library of Medicine's History of Medicine Division. He wrote that year, "The library is the historian's laboratory. A medical history collection should not be a museum where one comes to admire the rare and curious, but a working center providing first and foremost the essentials for teaching and research." Although Blake was talking about institutional collections, many medical bibliophiles have used their personal libraries as a source of inspiration for writing articles and books. As everyone watching knows, William Osler was the English-speaking world's leading physician at the turn of the 19th century, and it's impossible to exaggerate his influence on 4 generations of medical book collectors. I know that several individuals watching this presentation trace the origins of their bibliophilia to him. Undeniably a bibliomaniac, Osler channeled some of his obsession with books into productive scholarship. In addition to his classic textbook and countless clinical papers, he wrote dozens of historical and biographical essays, many of which were inspired by books in his collection. The fun of the hunt, a phenomenon that animates all bibliomaniacs, led Osler to rummage through dusty book-stalls, seek out little-known dealers, and scour booksellers' catalogs. During Osler's years at Johns Hopkins from 1889 to 1905, he went abroad each summer. Several letters to friends and fellow bibliophiles reveal his insatiable appetite for old books. During a visit to Holland in 1901, Osler tried to be a typical tourist, but he was constantly distracted. His wife Grace informed a friend, "Dr. Osler has been really sightseeing on this trip and is very amusing. He looks at one picture in the collection and then flies off to a bookshop." In another letter she wrote, "We really had a delightful trip. The doctors Doc and Osler became utterly disgusted at every place where old books were not forthcoming and promptly wanted to leave." Osler's lust for old medical books preceded his love of medical history, but before long his bookish and historical interests merged. As the size and significance of his library grew during his Baltimore years, Osler began publishing a steady stream of historical and biographical articles. He also punctuated his lectures and bedside teaching rounds with historical tidbits relating to the disease being discussed. Meanwhile, several of Osler's Hopkins associates shared his interest in books and medical history. For example, pathologist William Welsh and gynecologist Howard Kelly assembled important libraries and participated regularly in meetings of the Johns Hopkins Hospital Historical Club. As their students and residents migrated to institutions across the country, several of them injected their bookish and historical interests into new environs. William Osler knew that his lectures and writings and his library had inspired many other individuals to collect medical books and to publish historical articles. He was very eager to have his library serve as a stimulus for scholarship after he died. When Osler decided to bequeath his world-class 7,500-volume collection to McGill University in Montreal, he wrote, "The library is to serve 2 functions, the education of students in the history and the methods of science and medicine, and to promote research into these subjects." Today, I would argue that anyone who has visited the Osler Library at McGill or has used their website knows that his goals were achieved. Osler played a major role in stimulating Harvey Cushing's interest in book collecting and medical bibliography. Cushing grew up in a bookish family and was educated at Yale and Harvard before going to Johns Hopkins in 1896 as William Halstead's assistant resident in surgery. Although Cushing collected books before he moved to Baltimore, it was his exposure to Osler, Kelly, Welsh, and Halstead that transformed him from a bibliophile into a bibliomaniac. Cushing, who lived next door to Osler at the turn of the century, recalled, Those fortunate enough to come as latchkeyers under Osler's neighborly influence became inoculated with his bibliophilic spirit. Like Osler, Cushing was more than a collector. His books were a major source of intellectual stimulation. The neurosurgeon's most notable historical achievements were his Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Osler and his biobibliography of Vesalius. Howard Kelly stimulated Cushing's interest in Vesalius when he gave him a copy of the second edition of the Fabrica. Speaking of Kelly, Cushing warned, "He has led many a librarian and many a hapless young student into a bibliophilic downfall." Cushing attended the dedication of the Osler Library at McGill in 1929. That experience contributed to his decision to bequeath his 15,000-volume collection to Yale, where it has inspired several generations of bibliophiles and scholars. Cushing argued that books must be accessible if they're to meet their full potential as a stimulus for scholarship. He declared, "I've always felt that a hospital or medical school that wished to cultivate a scholarly spirit must have its library on the ground floor. Books must be put in the student's path so that he will stumble over them." Swiss tuberculosis specialist Arnold Klebs and American neurophysiologist John Fulton were Cushing's close friends. They also suffered from bibliomania. In the midst of the Depression, Cushing worked hard to convince them to follow his example and donate their book collections to Yale. Cushing wrote to Klebs in 1934, "I woke up in the middle of the night with the thought, why not a Klebs-Fulton-Cushing collection, so that we three could go down to bibliophilic posterity hand in hand. I'm redrawing my will, and I plan to leave enough to start a professorship of the history of medicine." Cushing's two confidants shared his conviction that their books must be used. Klebs told Cushing that their unified collections must not become piously maintained cemeteries of books. These bibliomaniacs wanted their tripartite library they envisioned at Yale to provide ongoing opportunities for research and discovery in the history of medicine. John Fulton, the third man in this scheme, was 30 years younger than Cushing and Klebs. Fulton had been infected with bibliomania in 1921 when he was a Rhodes Scholar studying physiology at Oxford. He was bitten in Osler's library at 13 Norham Gardens, where the late Regius Professor's huge collection was being cataloged. Fulton's infection worsened as he visited more and more antiquarian bookshops. Fulton's longtime friend and fellow bibliophile Arnold Muirhead provided a graphic description of the American's book hunting style, writing, "He was always a most determined and thorough searcher. No amount of dust or dirt, no precarious ladder, and no seeming inaccessibility deterred him." Fulton told Muirhead in 1928, "My purpose is to acquire a reference library which will make me independent of the larger collections while writing a historical treatise of physiology." This statement about building a reference library implied that Fulton's appetite for books was modest, but it wasn't. He would collect thousands of volumes. Geoffrey Keynes, a popular British surgeon and prolific bibliographer, influenced fashion's personal blend of bibliomania and scholarship. Keynes' definitive bibliographies of Thomas Browne, William Harvey, and Robert Hooke were based on his own collections of their works. Fulton praised his approach to individual bibliography, claiming that he did much to transform a dull and dreary subject into an art that is both exciting and highly informative. Adopting Keynes' strategy, Fulton produced authoritative bibliographies of Robert Boyle, Richard Lauer, and John Mayo. He also published biographies of Harvey Cushing and Benjamin Silliman, a classic book about medical bibliographers, and dozens of historical articles. Reflecting his desire to promote interest in primary printed sources in the history of medicine, Fulton edited a collection of excerpts from classic publications in physiology. Fulton's selected readings in the history of physiology appeared in 1930. Years later, University of Kansas internist and medical historian Ralph Major published Classic Descriptions of Disease, a similar work that focused on clinical medicine. Major, a 1910 Johns Hopkins medical graduate, developed his interest in books and history at the institution Osler had recently left. In 1921, Major was appointed chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of Kansas. For the next half-century, he inspired interest in medical history among the school's students, faculty, and graduates. Major's colleague, Logan Clendenning, assisted him in this endeavor. Clendenning, a 1907 Kansas medical graduate, was a passionate collector and a prolific author of medical history books and articles. Major explained, as Clendenning's interest in medical history grew, his desire to possess the great classics in medicine grew. He soon assembled one of the finest private collections, which was at once the despair and envy of his bibliophilic friends. Ralph Major and Logan Clendenning inspired many other doctors to collect books. This led University of Iowa and UTMB internist and medical editor William Bean to observe in 1962, interest in medical history is so active around Kansas City that it's a waste of time to go to a secondhand bookstore. The medical books are all cleaned out. There's nothing left for the latecomer. Major and Clendenning, both bibliomaniacs, donated their collections to the University of Kansas School of Medicine. These gifts contributed to the founding of one of the nation's premier departments of medical history. In fact, several of America's leading medical history programs owe their existence to physician bibliophiles. I've already mentioned Yale University, but this was also the case at the University of Minnesota, the University of Wisconsin, and UCLA, among others. I purchased dozens of books that Ralph Major and Logan Clendenning had once owned in 1983, when the University of Kansas Medical Library sold its duplicates. It was a prolonged process, and I had to outbid Duke University. I'll repeat that. I had to outbid Duke University. That major acquisition propelled my personal library into a much higher orbit because Major and Clendenning, like Osler, collected the classics of medicine. Bob Hudson, a former Osler Society president, closed his letter, "Congratulations on your wonderful purchase. I only wish I could be there as you unwrap them one by one and begin to initiate them into your family." Bob knew that he was writing to a bibliomaniac. Now I'll turn to some other major medical bibliophiles whose collections and historical interests were more focused than the Kansas tag team of Major and Clendenning. Baltimore ophthalmologist Harry Friedenwald was one such individual. The two-volume edition of his collected writings and the catalog of his library reflect Friedenwald's success as a hybrid collector-historian who specialized in a subject unrelated to his career as an ophthalmologist. He assembled the world's finest collection of books relating to Jews and medicine and wrote dozens of articles on this theme. Legendary Johns Hopkins medical historian Ofsy Temkin praised the interplay of Friedenwald's bookish and historical interests, writing, "It was his large collection that stimulated Dr. Friedenwald towards his historical interests, and these researches in turn stimulated him to increase year by year his riches of manuscripts and cunables and other books." Friedenwald, like several collectors I've mentioned, wanted others to benefit from his bibliomania. He donated his comprehensive collection of books about Jews and medicine to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Each physician bibliophile historian that I've mentioned, from Samuel Gross in the mid-19th century to Harry Friedenwald in the mid-20th century, gave their books to a library. Although this form of philanthropy may alarm and frustrate some serious collectors, it has had important implications for scholarship. Meanwhile, some non-physicians created collections that have provided scholars with rich resources in the history of medicine and science. Electrical engineer Bern Dibner founded the Burndy Company in 1924 and began collecting science books 5 years later. Dibner was a bibliomaniac with several advantages. First, he specialized, collecting books related to the history of science. Second, he devoted much energy to reading and writing about this theme, which in turn informed his decision about what books to buy. Third, and this is most important, he was fabulously wealthy. Dibner's vast collections contain many classics. For example, his 1955 catalog, Heralds of Science, included first editions of Vesalius' Fabrica and Harvey's De Modo Cordis. Scholars have benefited greatly from the thousands of volumes from Dibner's collection that are now at the Smithsonian Library and the Huntington Library in California. In fact, most important institutional special collections owe much to the bibliophiles whose libraries were acquired through gift or purchase. Mayo Clinic librarian and historian Tom Keyes wrote in 1954, "The medical world is indebted to physicians who collect books. Medical librarians especially are grateful to bibliophilic physicians who spend a considerable number of years and not inconsiderable funds in quest of significant books to the enrichment of library collections. Gertrude Annan, librarian of the New York Academy of Medicine, expressed similar sentiments, declaring, "Any library starting to build a useful collection for the historian can do no better with its funds than to obtain collections on one subject already brought together painstakingly and lovingly over the years by a knowing enthusiast. This serves both history and the historian far better than a treasure of expensive highlights with only a high price in common." These and Annan's comments resonated with me as I began to contemplate what would happen to my own collections. Eventually, every serious bibliophile faces the dilemma of what to do with their books. Earlier, I explained that Harvey Cushing donated his world-class collection to Yale, but this wasn't his original plan. He anticipated sending his books to auction. Cushing told fellow bibliomaniac Arlo Klebs, "I've always intended to have a checklist of my books made and then to have them sold at auction by my executors so that others might have the pleasure of collecting them as I have done. But this idea has begun to wane in favor of leaving them to Yale to be kept together as the basis of a medico-historical collection." Cushing's decision to donate his books to an institution rather than auction them disappointed many collectors because it meant they wouldn't have an opportunity to acquire some of his treasures. The libraries of a few major medical book collectors have been auctioned in recent decades. At the turn of the century, two extraordinary collections assembled by San Francisco doctors were auctioned in New York. The three-part sale of Haskell Norman's collection at Christie's in 1998 and the sale of Meyer Friedman's collection at Sotheby's in 2001 included many medical classics that achieved record prices. These auctions and other considerations convinced me that I really needed to develop a strategy for dispersing my library. About 15 years ago, my wife Lois and I discussed various options. Michael Homan, Mayo Clinic's library director at the time, was there and part of the discussions. For several reasons, it seemed sensible to supplement Mayo's major collections of rare medical books. As a result, Lois and I have donated about 17,000 books to the clinic since 2010. We also established an endowment to support a Center for the History of Medicine at the institution. Although my primary approach to dispersing my library has been to donate books, I've also sold about 2,000 books, off-prints, and letters at auction. Between 2019 and 2022, Bonhams held one live auction and 3 separate online sales. Overall, I was pleased with the results. As some watching this presentation know, some records were set, but there were many bargains. I'm happy that so many books I enjoyed owning for so many years were welcomed into new homes. My comments about the dispersal of thousands of my books in recent years sets the stage for a flashback, a very personal flashback. How did I acquire them? In this part of the presentation, I'll describe the changing landscape of book collecting since I became a bibliomaniac 6 decades ago. I was born in 1946 and began collecting stamps and coins when I was about 8 years old. But after a few years, those common hobbies were replaced by a new focus that was very unusual for a 14-year-old. I started collecting old books in 1961 when I was in high school in Yardley, Pennsylvania. I spent many Saturdays at Travers Bookstore just across the Delaware River in Trenton, New Jersey. Located in the center of what was then a thriving downtown, Travers had been founded in the late 19th century. The main floor of the 3-story building was devoted to new books. The basement housed paperbacks, textbooks, and a few hundred used books that were tucked away in a small side room. That is where I bought my first old book, an edition of Homer's Odyssey that had been published exactly 100 years earlier. Travers Bookstore had some secret spaces that changed my life after they were revealed to me in 1961. The store's second-generation owners, 2 brothers in their 70s, had closed off the top 2 floors several years earlier. The dust-covered staircase, off-limits to customers, was concealed behind curtains near the main floor checkout counter. Serendipity helps to explain how I gained access to these hidden floors. The top 2 floors were revealed to me in response to a question I asked about a specific 19th century book. A few weeks after I bought Homer's Odyssey, I was visiting my cousins, who lived on a farm in western Pennsylvania that has been in our family since the 1840s. This photograph of the farm signifies the good luck I had as a 14-year-old boy during my summer visit. My uncle took me and a cousin to a country auction where I bought 2 boxes of books for $2.25. One of those boxes contained the first volume of James G. Blaine's 2-volume set, 20 Years of Congress. I wanted to find volume 2. Back home, on my next visit to the Trenton bookstore, I asked Lewis Traver, the friendlier brother, if he had any idea how or where I might acquire volume 2 of Blaine's book. He told me to follow him, and we headed to an old elevator reserved for the staff. Mr. Traver shut the door, and we went up to the closed-off second floor. When he opened the elevator door and turned on the lights, I was sure I was on the threshold of book hunter's heaven. There were at least 100,000 old books on the deserted and dusty top 2 floors of an otherwise bustling business. Mr. Traver knew exactly where to find the needle in this gigantic haystack. He showed me a set of Blaine's 1884 publication. The price, written in pencil decades earlier, was $2. It would be mine, and I was hooked. During high school, I spent many Saturdays alone, always alone, on the top 2 floors of Traver's bookstore. I bought dozens of books on a wide range of subjects, including Civil War history and African exploration. This is a good place to admit that I was not a reader at this point in my life. I was a collector. My goal was to acquire old books rather than to read them. I should also mention that Lois and I had our first date on Friday the 13th of December 1963. It didn't take her long to understand the concept of bibliomania. In the mid-1970s, I began to read a lot. That transformation took place when I was a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at Johns Hopkins. My customized clinical scholars program combined a fellowship in cardiology with a master's degree program in the history of medicine. By then, I was an avid collector of medical books and was developing a passion for historical research and writing. So scholarly pursuit led me to read lots of books, but I read them for purpose rather than pleasure. Physicians have been overrepresented among book collectors for generations. Ellen Wells was chief of special collections at the Smithsonian Libraries in 1983, when she documented this fact in a list of printed catalogs of scientists' libraries dating back to the 17th century. 3/4 of the 880 scientist collectors that she identified were actually physicians, and they collected books on a wide range of subjects. Every serious bibliophile confronts the question of what to collect. The scope and significance of the volumes a person has acquired reveal whether he or she has formed a coherent collection or simply accumulated a bunch of books. Focused and thematic collecting, a tradition that began in the 18th century, has both practical and philosophical advantages. Here are my thoughts. After identifying a theme, a medical bibliophile should make an effort to learn about the history of their chosen subject. They should acquire, or at least have access to, the relevant secondary sources. These histories, bibliographies, and biographies provide valuable perspective in terms of what books and journal articles should be sought for a specialized collection. They also facilitate historical research if the collector decides to use their library for scholarly purposes. Once a collector has identified a specific title they want to add to their library, the next step is finding it. Most bibliophiles and all bibliomaniacs enjoy the fun of the hunt. The options for acquiring books include visiting bookstores, reading booksellers' catalogs, bidding at auctions, and attending book fairs. These traditional approaches remained relatively stable as my bibliomania worsened during the final quarter of the 20th century. But the invention and maturation of the internet book sites such as ABE and Biblio dramatically changed the dynamics of searching for and buying books. The same is true for bidding on books at auction. In 1977, I was 30 years old when I coordinated a luncheon symposium on medical book collecting at the annual meeting of the American Association for the History of Medicine. That experience led me to publish my first article on collecting medical books in 1979. For perspective, that was 2 years before IBM sold its first PC and 15 years before almost anyone used what would be called the internet. In a 1992 article I wrote, there are many challenges confronting medical book collectors as we approach the 21st century, but there are also many opportunities. Well, in the 3 decades since I published that paper, book collectors and collections librarians have witnessed the book hunting environment change much more rapidly and dramatically than anyone could have imagined. I'll use my decades of experience as a buyer and seller of medical books to illustrate some of these changes. Most 20th century bibliophiles, and virtually all bibliomaniacs, made regular visits to bookshops near where they lived, or when they traveled. After Lois and I moved from Baltimore to Marshfield, Wisconsin in 1978, we would drive to the East Coast to visit relatives about twice a year. Rather than taking a direct route, we always zigzagged along the way, stopping at what I considered to be good book towns, such as Madison, Chicago, Ann Arbor, Cleveland, Columbus, and Pittsburgh. Our stop was Brinklow, Maryland. It was in Brinklow, a village about 20 miles north of Washington. The Old Hickory Bookshop specialized in medical books. I went there dozens of times over the years. By the time Old Hickory closed in the mid-1990s, it had supplied 2 generations of collectors and librarians with thousands of old medical books. Joanna Grimes, its chain-smoking co-owner, produced simple catalogs on a regular basis and oversaw a huge stock of books and off-prints in her house and 2 outbuildings. Over the past half-century, I visited hundreds of bookshops in North America, Britain, and continental Europe. Printed directories were once indispensable for planning book hunting trips. It comes as no surprise that almost all the bookstores I visited, both large and small, have closed. That's unfortunate, because for generations, open shops functioned as incubators for bibliophiles and bibliomaniacs. Printed bookseller catalogs, another basic source for books, have also largely disappeared. For generations, many collectors acquired their most treasured volumes from catalogs that came in the mail. Booksellers, a vital link in the supply chain of old books, now rely on the internet to publicize their holdings. Vern Dibner dedicated his 1955 book, Heralds of Science, to book dealers in many lands who patiently gathered, preserved, collated, and cataloged our heritage of science. Legendary Los Angeles dealer Jake Zeitlin wrote the following tribute to Dibner in 1973. He represents to booksellers the ideal type of bookman, the man who buys a book because he wants it and not as a speculation, who knows and values what he buys in terms of its importance in the field of his collecting. When Jake Zeitlin wrote his tribute to Dibner, I had just embarked on a transformational journey, both in terms of my medical career and my bookish life. In the spring of 1972, Lois and I were preparing to move from Baltimore to Manhattan, where I would begin a medical internship at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. By this time, I owned about 2,000 mostly unimportant books on a dizzying array of subjects. Just before Lois and I moved to New York City in 1972, we opened our apartment to several dozen individuals who had read my small newspaper advertisement announcing a one-day sale of hundreds of books priced at $2 or less. This memorable event marked the beginning of my life as a hybrid book collector, bookseller. The intensity of my medical internship, every other night call for much of the year, and the limited space for books in our 1-bedroom apartment on East 69th Street forced me to develop new strategies to manage my worsening bibliomania. With very little free time and no car in the city, I could no longer take boxes of miscellaneous volumes to open shops, hoping to trade them for medical books. Meanwhile, opportunities for buying medical books were increasing. Lois and I were both working, so I had more money to spend on my growing addiction. In 1973, when I was a resident at New York Hospital, I began placing advertisements to buy medical books in every issue of A.B. Bookman's Weekly, a trade journal. As a result, postcards and letters offering to sell me medical books appeared in our mailbox almost daily. One benefit of living in Manhattan was that I didn't have to travel far to visit several used bookstores. The Lexington Avenue subway line near our apartment led to Argosy Strand and more than a dozen shops in the legendary 4th Avenue book row near Union Square. I would visit several of them at least once a month on Saturdays when I wasn't on call. During our first year in Manhattan, I began preparing typewritten lists of medical books that I was willing to sell as my collecting interests began to focus on specific themes, such as cardiology, William Osler, and off-prints of articles written by prominent physicians, surgeons, and medical scientists. I met Jeremy Norman in 1973, 2 years after he issued his first book catalog. He would soon become America's leading book specialist in antiquarian medical books. I devoured Jeremy's catalogs along with those issued by other dealers who sold medical books. By 1975, when Lois and I returned to Baltimore for my cardiology fellowship at Hopkins, I was a hopeless bibliomaniac, addicted to old medical books. But I've long been grateful I was addicted to books rather than drugs. If I'd been hooked on drugs instead of books, I might well have succumbed not long after Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison overdosed and died. As it turned out, and thanks to my very supportive wife Lois and our patient daughters Catherine and Elizabeth, I was able to sublimate my bibliomania into a passion for historical research and writing. My hybrid collector-dealer approach to managing my addiction had another benefit. I learned a lot about the history of medicine and surgery by buying and selling books on specialties I didn't collect. Earlier, I mentioned auctions as a source of books. I attended my first book auction in 1975 when Swan Galleries sold the Herbert McLean Evans Library of Medical Classics. In fact, it was just one of his many libraries he was forced to sell in a series of unfortunate marriages. For me, it was both a memorable and costly event. As I wrote a check equal to a month's salary as a medical resident, I was standing beside Ida Schumann, a doyen of medical and scientific booksellers. She surely sensed a bit of buyer's remorse because she reassured me that I would never regret paying $550 for the 16-volume first series of the index catalog of the libraries of the Surgeon General's office. Mrs. Schumann was right. I found the experience of bidding at a live auction exhilarating, enlightening, and expensive. In 1976, I bought several lots at Swan's sale of Carlton Chapman's collection of cardiology and physiology. Those purchases, made when I was a cardiology fellow, contributed to my decision to assemble a comprehensive collection of books and offprints related to cardiovascular disease. During the 1980s, as my bibliomania surged, I received encouragement from many booksellers, especially Jake Zeitlin and Jeremy Norman. Demand for old medical books increased dramatically during the final decades of the 20th century as the number of collectors grew and as more institutions established or enlarged special collections devoted to the history of medicine. Those trends led several individuals to launch full-time or part-time medical book businesses in the 70s and 80s. In this context, a few physician collectors ventured into the world of mail-order bookselling. In the 1990s, more than a dozen doctors advertised that they bought and sold medical books in the AB Weekly. In 1920, only one person on my list of physician booksellers remained active and issued catalogs on a regular basis. Jim Goodrich, an internationally recognized neurosurgeon and longtime member of the American Osler Society. Tragically, Jim died of COVID in March of that year at the age of 73. Antiquarian book fairs deserve mention because they provide collectors and dealers with a unique opportunity to inspect lots of books and interact with many kindred spirits. National and regional book fairs exploded in popularity during the closing decades of the 20th century. Large book fairs, especially those sponsored by the ABAA, have weathered the Internet's disruptive force on the book trade better than smaller fairs. A significant percentage of the dealers who participate in local or regional fairs are part-time booksellers, and many of them have stopped displaying selections from their stock at these fairs as their online sales have increased and the attendance at smaller fairs has decreased. In the final part of this personal perspective, I'll discuss some of the challenges and opportunities facing current-day collectors. First, I want to reiterate the importance of focused collecting. Several prominent medical bibliophiles of earlier generations sought time-honored classics of medicine. Osler popularized this strategy, known as milestone or high spot collecting. Today, assembling a comprehensive collection of medical milestones is virtually impossible. Even if a private collector or institution had the money to buy a significant number of recognized classics, such as the 19 items in medicine in the medical section of Dibner's Heralds of Science, or the items in the 1994 Grolier Club exhibit 100 Books Famous in Medicine, most of these books rarely come on the market. The great majority of them are in institutional libraries rather than in private collections. Progressive specialization and subspecialization in medicine during the second half of the 20th century led many medical book collectors to adopt a more promising approach. As new collectors appeared on the scene, a significant percentage of them collected books and offprints related to their chosen clinical field. Fortunately, some of the most important specialized collections assembled by medical doctors in recent decades have been described in printed catalogs. These include Bernard Becker's ophthalmology collection, Evan Bedford's cardiology collection, Eugene Cortis's plastic surgery collection, and Robert Rubin's otology collection, among others. Because most medical specialties and subspecialties developed during the 20th century, a doctor who chooses to collect in his or her clinical field has no choice but to acquire items published in the last 100 or so years. The collectors of 20th century medical books and periodical publications face significant challenges. For example, the enormous number of medical books and articles published in recent decades makes it extremely difficult for a collector or librarian to identify truly significant contributions to medical science or practice. Individuals with specialized training who devote time to learning about the history of the subject they collect are in the best position to identify important publications. Fortunately, detailed histories of many medical and surgical specialties have been published in recent years. Cardiology was my specialty and main collecting interest for 4 decades. As I've documented in 2 books, cardiology is a 20th century specialty. With the exception of the stethoscope, essentially all of the technologies and procedures that define current-day heart care were developed after 1900. In fact, most of them were introduced into practice after World War II. My cardiology collection, which was donated to the Huntington in 2021, included about 2,700 books and 4,000 offprints relating to cardiovascular medicine, surgery, science, and technology. And note these 2 juxtaposed images of bookshelves. That's where they were, that's where they are. By the way, the wooden bookshelves on the left are repopulated with books from other parts of our house. Collecting offprints has been a long-standing passion of mine. This reflects the fact that for generations, most medical advances were first reported in journals rather than books. Smithsonian librarian Ellen Wells wrote in 1986, "Reprints are important in the communications of scientific knowledge. Scholars collect and exchange them for their personal libraries. In recent decades, reprints of famous and seminal articles have become very collectible. With the shift in first publication from monographs to journals, the collector of historically important scientific and medical contributions has had to seek certain reprints or issues of journals in which the articles appeared." New York Academy of Medicine librarian Gertrude Annan gave this advice to those making decisions about institutional collections. "The lowly reprint should not be scorned, even if the original article is in the library's collection. Reprints of outstanding contributions to science, especially those signed by the authors, are collector's items of great cost. Librarians must look at reprints not as trash to be thrown out without question, but rather as potential rarities." Terry Cavanaugh, Duke University's medical rare book librarian and part-time medical bookseller, wrote in 1970, "Offprints have validity as the first separate appearance of a work." He acknowledged that offprints of classic articles had become, in his words, excessively rare and valuable. But turning from specific offprints to offprints in general, Cavanaugh claimed, "Large numbers of offprints on particular subjects by a number of authors, such as frequently come to libraries from the files of local donors, are rarely significant enough to repay the effort of extensive cataloging, and without it are not likely to be used." This pragmatic advice about managing collections of offprints helps explain a decision many medical libraries made in recent decades. They discarded their offprint collections without any significant attempt to identify truly important articles or association copies. Obviously, this widespread destruction of offprints has implications for present-day collectors and special collection librarians who hope to acquire offprints by a specific author or a specific subject. University of Wisconsin bibliographer John Noy addressed this issue in 1968 when he wrote, "Offprints, by their very nature, are scarce from the day of their printing. They seldom survive the death of their recipient. Not even libraries take trouble to preserve them. Certainly after 100 years, a scientific paper in offprint form is practically unfindable." The future of offprint collecting is problematic for another reason. In the past 2 decades, offprints have been replaced almost entirely by electronic PDFs, which can be downloaded and printed on demand. In 1989, I got dozens of reprint requests for an off-print of my New England Journal article on William Osler, but I don't remember getting any requests for off-prints of my 2006 New England Journal article on the history of electrocardiography and atrial fibrillation. Another personal anecdote illustrates what I term the death of the off-print. In 2016, I had breakfast with 18 senior medical students at the University of Chicago who were being inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha, the Medical Honor Society. Only 2 of the 18 individuals even knew what an off-print or reprint was. This demonstrates how quickly PDFs and innovation associated with the internet replaced a 2-century-old tradition. As a result, the personal and physical link between authors and readers or collectors that off-prints represented no longer exists. Books, although not as ephemeral as off-prints, have long been viewed as an endangered species. In 1888, English bibliographer William Blades devoted several chapters of his monograph, The Enemies of Books, to things that threatened the physical state or survival of books. About a century after Blades published his book, a more serious enemy of books became widespread in institutional contexts. During the past 2 generations, university and medical school libraries have deaccessioned millions of books, and that term deaccession is often a euphemism for destroyed. In a 2009 article, Beyond Books, Libraries Look to the Future, academic library dean David Lewis predicted before long almost all of the books in existence will be available electronically. For bibliophiles, the article's photograph of Lewis resting his outstretched arms on empty bookshelves is deeply disturbing. Unfortunately, this scenario continues to play out in many institutions. In 2011, the AOS and AAHM meetings were held at Johns Hopkins. Several people attended the reception at the Welsh Medical Library in a big room dominated by John Singer Sargent's iconic painting, The Four Doctors. 2 walls of the room were lined with empty bookshelves, a dramatic and disturbing visual expression of the library's decision to discard tens of thousands of medical books and journals. Each of the 4 doctors, William Welsh, William Halstead, William Osler, and Howard Kelly, were bibliophiles or bibliomaniacs. Many of the books and off-prints that they and others had donated to Hopkins were deaccessioned decades ago. In 1910, 1 year before the medical history meeting, the Johns Hopkins University Gazette published an article entitled Envisioning Welsh Library of the Future that quoted then library director Nancy Roederer. Usually I don't read text from slides, but this published account is too important to paraphrase. Roederer said that the physical collection, which has been decreasing, will continue to do so. Many print items now available in electronic form will be removed from the building and recycled by 2012. Note, recycled by 2012. In the future, fewer paper items will be added, and 98% of the budget goes to electronic materials. Understand that Johns Hopkins is by no means unique when it comes to discarding medical books and journals. In fact, Nancy Roederer's candor is rather refreshing, even if her message is deeply disturbing. Over the past half-century, the scenario she described is played out in most medical school libraries and almost every medical society library. Fortunately, some libraries chose to sell or give their duplicates or discards to collectors, booksellers, or other libraries. When contemplating the future of book collecting, it's important to appreciate that the bond that has traditionally linked private collectors and institutional libraries is fragile. Special collectors librarian Evert Volverts wrote in 1980, many major research collections were assembled by private collectors. In the process of collecting, they've often opened up new areas for research and scholarship. The curiosity, persistence, and accomplishment of the private collector are, unfortunately, sometimes underrated by the institutional collector to his or her detriment. British librarian Roderick Cave listed 3 key ingredients in his recipe for building special collections. He proclaimed, to be good at attracting donations to their library, the rare books librarian must combine the erudition of the scholar, the enthusiasm of the lover, and the persuasiveness of the con man. I want to end on a positive note. It's still possible to build a significant personal medical library that can be a source of satisfaction and a resource for scholarship. To do this, however, an individual must have passion for collecting, financial resources, physical space, and importantly, a supportive family. The great medical book collectors of earlier times enjoyed these advantages. Some present bibliophiles are equally fortunate. I certainly have been. Significant private libraries are being formed, and physician book collectors are still contributing to the literature of medical history. Special Collections librarian Alice Schreier addressed the future of book collecting in a 2015 lecture to members of the Grolier Club. At one point, she asked, will generations brought up on mobile devices develop the intellectual interest in and reverence for physical books that bring us all together? I think the answer to Schreier's question depends in part on whether those of us who value books and appreciate the unique role that special collections play in promoting scholarship are willing to nurture a new generation of bibliophiles. I hope the answer is yes. Thanks very much for this opportunity to share my very personal perspective on medical book collecting and scholarship with an audience full of kindred spirits. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for being our inaugural lecturer in what I hope will be a series of virtual AOS lectures that will sort of tide us over between our annual AOS meeting. We have about 10 minutes, and I'm not sure how this will work, but I know that there may be some folks out there who have a quick comment or a quick question. We'll try to unmute you, raise your hand, and we'll take a few minutes for questions and comments, if there are any. Nadim, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Bruce. That was great. Really good to, hear your story again, and your talk was very well illustrated. And I know that both my brother and myself benefited from the sale of your books, and I bought many lots when they went on auction, and it actually added very significantly to my own personal collection. So thank you for that as well. I actually had I'll ask you one question, which I think you may be able to answer. It relates to the Old Hickory Bookshop. When I was writing my review on Walter Reginald Bett for the first volume of our journal, Osleriana, I found that Walter Bett's library on his death was sold by his wife to the Old Hickory Bookshop. Then I actually tried to contact them because I was very interested in tracing his collection to write about it for the article. I wasn't able to make contact, and then someone told me that the bookshop had since closed. I wanted to know if you know when that happened, and also if there's any way to trace, the previous records, because, Bett founded the Osler Club, and it would be of interest to me and maybe others as to what he had in his collection.
Right. Well, the Old Hickory Bookshop closed in the mid-1990s. Jo Grimes was really quite a character. Anyone who knew her would understand exactly what I meant. She certainly inspired literally two generations of bibliomaniacs. The only reason that I know Walter Bett's, some of his things went there, I was an avid collector of engraved medical portraits. And I got some portraits that were in Walter Bett's collection, but I never saw any critical mass of books that were from Walter Bett. My guess is that they were acquired. I started going there probably in about 1974, 1975. And I don't want to get into too much digression, but I doubt very, very much if any of their papers were preserved. I think it was not organized to that point.
Thanks. Joel Howell has a question.
More of a comment. Thanks, Bruce, very much for a wonderful talk. I'm just going to briefly just relate a vignette in which Bruce was very kind to an amateur book collector. We were wandering around a used bookstore and came across the Dictionary of Scientific Biography missing a volume and thus heavily discounted. And I wasn't going to get it. And Bruce said, all you got to do is buy this and then buy the single volume and you'll have a complete set. And then he said, if you don't do it, I will. So, you remember that, Bruce?
I do indeed, and I'm glad you bought it.
It still sits in my office, and I have used it in recent days. So thank you
Sure.
for helping out us amateurs in the group.
You bet.
We'll save the last question for the inimitable Christopher Bowes.
Oh, I just want to
Chris?
say great talk, Bruce. I will say, when I bought one of my first antiquarian medical books was from W. Bruce Fye in Marshfield, and Bruce was kind enough to send me some of the off-prints that were shown about how to collect medical books. I was a resident then, and I really never forgot it. And I think it's an example that I've tried to follow as people express an interest in collecting books, kind of trying to give them advice on, maybe focusing their collection, because that was something, the theme that you gave about collecting, you gave that advice to me when I was a PGY 3 neurology resident, when I had enough money to buy my first Gower's manual. So I've always appreciated that. I still have those off prints signed and by you and in my W. Bruce Fye section. So thank you.
Joan, if I could add one anecdote, I think people will appreciate this. I mentioned that I started the mail order book business in 1972 and advertised weekly in this. It was the size of an old-fashioned TV guide, AB Weekly. And so Lois and I didn't have a car for the first 2 years we were in New York. The final year, when I was a senior resident, we had a car, and we went on a book hunting expedition into New England. And we were driving through. I don't know whether it was Vermont or New Hampshire. I'm not sure which place, but I noticed on the side of the road in a street in a little tiny town, old books. So I stopped and I went up to the door and knocked on the door. It's just a clapboard house in the midst of a bunch of houses in this little tiny town. And a woman opened the door and I said, you're selling books? She says, yes. I said, well, do you have any old medical books? She says, well, it's a sad thing about the books. We're moving the business to New Hampshire and we had a fire and we lost a lot of the books, but it doesn't really matter because we sell the medical books to Mr. Fye in New York. And so I said, that's me. That's me. And she said, this is the truth. It's a quote. I thought you'd be a little old man with a cane. That was 50 years ago. I do not yet use a cane. I am an old man, age 78, but that's sort of one of those things that puts things in perspective. Well, I want to say, though, it's been great fun to connect in this electronic way with members of the Osler Society. I also want to apologize. Some of you may be familiar with this. I'm going to miss the Pasadena meeting, and you have no idea how much that frustrates me. You saw my cardiology library is at the Huntington, so I would have been able to toast my books at the Huntington with you. But it so happens that the meeting is exactly simultaneous with the American Association for the History of Medicine's 100th centennial meeting. And having been a former president of it, having been a Lifetime Achievement Award winner and winning the Welsh Medal, and having gone to 2 Osler meetings in a row instead of the AHM, I thought it would be probably not well received if I didn't show up for the 100th. So I apologize in advance for missing what I am sure will be a terrific meeting in Pasadena and not seeing you all in person. And believe me, I'm going to be at all the Osler meetings in the future until I'm. Oh, another quick anecdote. So we have 2 daughters. You saw their pictures. The younger daughter, Elizabeth, was fairly shy as a youngster. Her older sister, Catherine, was very outgoing. So we lived in Marshfield, Wisconsin, a city of 18,000 and a county with more cows than people. We went out to dinner one evening when Elizabeth was probably about 8 and Catherine was about 11. And I think Paul Kligfield is on this call. Paul suggested that we buy the lot next door to our house just to keep from a house being built there. So this comes back to the story. So we're sitting at dinner. Elizabeth, the generally quiet, shy one, says, Dad, what's going to happen to your books when you die? And I looked at her and I said, Elizabeth, that's why we bought the lot next door. They're going to come in, they're going to dig a big trench, put me in the bottom, books on top, and cover it up. And she said, don't do that. Give them to me and I'll sell them. I looked at her sister. I said, Catherine, I'm sorry, but your sister has dibs on the books. What can I say? So it becomes a challenge that each of us faces as time goes on. I'm happy I found the opportunity to donate thousands of books to Mayo Clinic, and a great, a collection, focused collection to the Huntington. Now I'm trying to figure out where my collection of extra illustrated books and my collection of medical art, prints, and engravings that many of you saw in Rochester. But once again, thank you so much to David Wolf for this idea, for Joan Richardson and the folks at UTMB who have been fantastic at holding my hand. We had several trial runs at this, and it worked out great. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We'll miss you in Pasadena. Thank you all for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. I think this was a raging success, and hopefully we can do it again soon.